Growing up, the hunting party always consisted of at least 3 members: myself, my father, and my grandfather. Now, growing up with these 2 men, they always made it a point to argue about what farming practices would be the most beneficial for farmers. And for 2 men who had never actually worked on a farm a day in their lives, they had incredibly spirited debates about it. But what's important to understand is that farming is more than just how it impacts the farmers. My grandfather was an agronomist for over 30 years, where he worked hand in hand with farmers to help them. And my father is a contractor whose main clientele is farmers. Farming supports our local economies and is integral to the success of not only my family, but millions of families across the United States. So with this extensive background in listening to my relatives bicker, it's important to understand that when looking to the future of agricultural technology, it's important to find a balance between the older practices of farming and the newer practices of farming. So let's start with some of these older practices. First, looking at tree lines. Now, tree lines were popularized by FDR in the Dust Bowl era to help with soil wind erosion. And they were incredibly effective in this. However, according to an article by Public Radio International, they found that recently farmers have been working to take these tree-lined shelter belts out of their fields, regardless if it is a good year or a bad year for the farmers. However, while they may be getting an extra acre or 2 out of removing these tree lines, agroforestry officials call this move short-sighted, as tree lines offer numerous benefits not only to the farmer, but the local ecosystems. As tree lines can provide shelter for local wildlife, which help cut down on insects in the fields, while also providing a stabilized microclimate for corn and other such crops to be more effective in the fields. Tree lines are something that are at the moment going away, but it is something that we should continually look to as an old-fashioned practice that is still incredibly effective for today's modern farmer. But not only are tree lines the old-fashioned way of the future, but also cover crops. Now, cover crops are one of the most ancient farming practices ever, used in civilizations dating back over 3,000 BC. Even our first president, George Washington, used cover crops like buckwheat and rye on his farm at Mount Vernon. However, cover crops are an incredibly effective way in order to help maximize the field nutrients and also help the bottom line of farmers. As a study conducted by Professor D.B. Janes of Iowa State University found that when using a rye cover crop, they were able to reduce the amount of nitrate found in water runoff by over 48%, making it the most effective cover crop that they tested. With this and the added natural fertilization from cover crops, we see that this can either help the farmers by increasing their yields or help their bottom line by having additional crops to sell. And now the old-fashioned ways are equally effective. It's important to understand what modern technology is doing for farming. Let's first look to GM crops. Now, GM crops have been used for centuries technically, but only very recently have we been able to sequence the genome of crops in order to use them to their full effectiveness. According to an article by The Economist, they find that genetically modified crops can actually help reduce emissions on farms, as because they can be made herbicide resistant, they can reduce the tilling needed by farmers. And this less tillage resulted in the equivalent of 12 million cars being removed from the road because of the reduced tractor emissions in 2015 alone. But furthermore, genetically modified crops can be made to be pest resistant as well. And in fact, according to the USDA, when genetically modified corn is used in fields that is resistant to pests like the corn borer and the bollworm, they found that not only were those fields successful in reducing the pests, but even neighboring fields were successful in having less pests because of the effectiveness of these crops in order to reduce these kind of insects. And genetically modified crops are one direction, but the final direction I'm going to discuss with you today is precision agriculture. Now, it's something you've heard a lot about even today, and it's become a rather buzzword for modern farming. And while it is incredibly broad, at its core, it's about integrating technology with traditional farming practices in order to maximize the output of every inch of farmland. And this can be done in multiple different ways. But the most common one that we often see is the integration of GPS technology, which John Deere put in its tractors, combines, and other such farming equipment back in 2001. What they found in internal studies now 10 years after, what they had seen is that when using GPS in their systems, farmers were able to reduce the amount of hours they had in the tractor and combine by over 20% by increasing uniformity and effectiveness of their planting, spraying, and harvesting. Incredibly effective numbers. Another way in which technology can be used is smart irrigation, where farmers can place sensors connected to a cloud in their field, which monitors the amount of water in the area for the crops. And when such water is needed on these crops, then at that point, water is released into, into the field in order to maximize the effectiveness of it. And in fact, they found that it reduced the amount of water used on irrigated fields by over 20% by using it only when it was going to be most effective in growing these crops. So when looking to how farming is going to change in the future, it's important to strike a balance between what farmers know in the older technologies and what is coming up soon on the horizon with newer technologies, everywhere from tree lines and cover crops to the cutting edge of modern technology and bioengineering. So when looking to the future of how we can preserve the environment while also helping farmers' bottom line, finding this balance is something that can satisfy farmers and even the most ardent of bickering relatives. Thank you.